I sent one photo to our family group chat. My son Caleb was 8 years old, lying in a hospital bed with a fever monitor clipped to his finger and a paper cape, the one he had made himself out of construction paper and a red crayon, draped over his thin shoulders. He had insisted the nurses let him wear it, even hooked up to and for. "I just want them to see him," I wrote. "He's asking for Grandma and Uncle Marcus." My brother replied first, "Swamped. You'll figure it out." Then my mother added, "He pulled through. Don't make this our emergency, too." I read those words standing in a hospital corridor at 11 at night, and I did not cry where anyone could see me. I typed back 3 words, "Understood. Thank you," and turned my phone face down on the windowsill. For hours later, on the other side of the city, my brother stood under gold stage lights at the Hometown Heroes Gala, accepting a Community Champion Award, telling a ballroom full of donors that no child should ever fight alone. He had no idea a local news crew was already inside my son's hospital room. And he had no idea that within 48 hours, the very foundation applauding him would be asking where thousands of dollars raised in my son's name had actually gone. Welcome back to the channel, where quiet people finally draw the line and family drama meets a calm, steady voice. If you believe children should never be treated as inconveniences and quiet people eventually deserve justice, leave a comment, hit subscribe, and stay with me, because what happened at that gala is only the beginning. My name is Renee Foster. I was 36 years old, a widow, and the only parent my son Caleb had left. My husband, Mark, died of a sudden heart attack while out for his usual morning run 2 years earlier, the kind of ordinary Tuesday that ends with a stranger performing CPR on your husband on the sidewalk while you are still asleep at home. Since then, every school form, every grocery run, every bedtime, and every hard decision had belonged to me alone. I had learned to carry things quietly. What I want you to understand about me before I tell you the rest is what I did for a living, because it matters more than you might think. I worked in patient financial services at Ridgeline Medical Center, an insurance appeals specialist, to be exact. My job was to sit across from families drowning in medical bills and figure out, line by line, whether an insurance company had wrongfully denied a claim, whether a billing code had been entered incorrectly, whether money that should have covered a family's care had somehow vanished into a gap between 2 departments that never spoke to each other. I had spent 9 years reading paper trails other people assumed no one would ever check. I had learned that fraud rarely looks dramatic. It looks like a memo line that says one thing and a bank transfer that does something else. It looks like a spreadsheet that balances beautifully right up until you ask where one specific dollar actually landed. I mention this now because it is the exact skill that would, months later, take apart my own family's carefully constructed story, one line item at a time. Caleb was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia when he was 6. We had already fought through 18 months of chemotherapy, a remission that made me believe in miracles again, and then, 3 weeks before that photograph in the hospital bed, a relapse that put us right back where we started, except this time with a fever that would not break, and an infection his weakened immune system could not fight off on its own. Neutropenic sepsis, the doctors called it. I called it the worst 48 hours of my life, sitting beside a bed watching numbers on a monitor and praying they would move in the right direction. Growing up, I had learned early that love in my family was not distributed evenly. My brother Marcus was 3 years older than me, and in our house that seemed to entitle him to something I never quite understood but always felt, the way you feel a draft in an old house without ever finding the crack in the wall. When Marcus got mediocre grades, my mother called him a big-picture thinker who did not test well. When I brought home straight A's, she told me not to make my brother feel bad. When Marcus dropped out of 2 different colleges before finally finishing a business degree at 26, my father called it him finding his footing. When I needed $400 for a deposit on my first apartment after college, my mother asked why I could not simply wait until I had saved more, as if patience were a virtue she had never once required of her son. I stopped keeping score somewhere in my 20s, not because the scoring stopped, but because pointing it out only ever earned me the label of bitter, jealous, dramatic. So I did what people like me tend to do. I made myself useful instead of resentful. I remembered birthdays. I showed up early to help set up for every family gathering and stayed late to help clean up after everyone Marcus never lifted a finger for. I told myself that if I simply kept being easy to love, eventually the love would even itself out. When Mark and I had Caleb, I let myself believe, for a few golden months, that a grandchild might finally soften something in my mother. She came to the hospital when he was born, held him like he was made of glass, cried real tears, and called herself the proudest grandmother in the state. For a little while, I believed we had turned some invisible corner. Then Mark died, and the corner disappeared as quickly as it had come. My mother came to the funeral, stayed for the reception, folded exactly 2 dish towels in my kitchen while surveying the mess of casserole dishes other people had brought, and told me, "You'll have to be strong now. You have a child to think about." As if I had somehow forgotten. As if strength were a thing people say when they have already decided not to help carry the weight themselves. My brother sent a sympathy card with his assistant's handwriting on the envelope and did not call for 3 weeks. After that, people stopped asking how I was doing and started asking whether I had gone back to work yet, whether Caleb was sleeping through the night, whether I needed anything practical, because practical questions never required anyone to actually sit with my grief. So I built a life that did not depend on them. I told myself that was strength, too. I worked full-time, learned every corner of the insurance appeals process the hard way because I needed to, and I raised my son mostly alone, the way I had learned to do most things. The first crack appeared about 4 months before the night I sent that photograph, though I did not recognize it as a crack at the time. Caleb's relapse diagnosis had just come in, and the bills, even with insurance, were staggering in a way that made my own professional expertise feel almost useless against the sheer size of the numbers. My mother, Diane, called me one evening sounding more engaged than she had in years. She said she wanted to help, that families should not have to face something like this alone, and that she was going to reach out quietly to relatives and old family friends to gather some support. I remember feeling something loosen in my chest when she said it, a small, foolish hope that maybe this, my son's illness, would be the thing that finally made her show up the way I had always wanted her to. She said she was setting up an online fundraising page so people could contribute directly, and asked me to send her a few recent photos of Caleb for it. I sent 3. One of him grinning in his baseball cap before he lost his hair the first time. One of him and Mark from 2 summers before Mark died. One of him asleep in a hospital bed during his first round of treatment, an image I hated sharing but that I knew, from my own work processing appeals, tended to move people to give more generously than a healthy, smiling photo ever would. My mother named the page Caleb's Fight Fund. She wrote a description full of soft, aching language about a brave little boy and a widowed mother trying to hold everything together. I will admit, reading it the first time, it made me cry because for one brief moment it felt like someone else finally understood what I had been carrying. I asked her, a few weeks in, how much the fund had raised and whether I should set up a separate account to receive it, since Caleb's ongoing treatment costs were mounting faster than my insurance appeals could keep pace with. She told me not to worry about the logistics, that she was keeping careful records and would consolidate everything into one organized payment once all the bills were finalized, so there would be no tax confusion for anyone. I did not push. I was exhausted in a way that made pushing feel impossible, the particular exhaustion of a parent doing hospital shifts, work shifts, and grief shifts all at once, with no partner to hand any of it off to. I told myself she finally wanted to help, and I did not want to be the daughter who questioned her mother's generosity. That was the first crack. Not a lie I caught in the act, but a door I chose not to look too closely at because looking too closely might have meant admitting I still did not trust her, even now. A few weeks later, my cousin Elise mentioned in passing that she had donated to the fund and hoped it was helping with everything. I thanked her, and something in her phrasing, everything, as if she assumed the money had already reached me in some tangible form, sat oddly in my stomach for the rest of the day. I mentioned it to my mother the next time we spoke. She said the donations were still being collected and that she wanted to wait until Caleb's treatment plan was fully mapped out before dispersing anything, so the money could be directed most efficiently. It sounded reasonable. It sounded, in fact, exactly like the kind of careful, responsible language I use myself every day at work when explaining a delay to an anxious patient. That was what made it so easy to believe. She was speaking my own professional language back to me, and I, of all people, should have recognized how easily that language can be used to stall rather than to help. I did not push again. Caleb had a fever that week that would not come down below 101, and I did not have room in me to fight two battles at once. I want to be honest with you here, because I think it matters. I am not telling you I suspected fraud from the very beginning. I am telling you that I felt something faintly wrong, the way you feel a splinter under skin too thick to see it clearly, and that I chose again and again to trust the woman who had raised me rather than trust the quiet unease sitting in my gut. It would take one more month, one more relapse of Caleb's fever, and one very specific night in a hospital corridor before that unease finally had a name. Caleb's fever broke, and we were sent home for what the oncology team called a fragile remission window, 3 weeks where he could exist somewhere close to a normal childhood before the next round of treatment began. I went back to work at Ridgeline, back to the quiet routine of reading other people's denied claims and finding the buried reason an insurance company owed a family money it had refused to pay. And it was during one of those very ordinary workdays that the second crack appeared, though I would not fully understand its shape for weeks. I was on my lunch break, scrolling through my phone without much attention, when I saw a post from my brother's fiancée, Simone. It was a photograph from a planning meeting for the upcoming Hometown Heroes Gala, an annual fundraiser hosted by the Rising Stars Foundation, a local nonprofit that funded pediatric programs at several hospitals in the region, Ridgeline included. Simone had captioned the photo, "So proud of Marcus for stepping up as this year's community champion. Family means everything." I read the caption twice. "Family means everything," posted by the fiancé of a man who had texted swamped, "You'll figure it out the last time my son had been hospitalized." I did not comment. I did not react. I simply took a screenshot, the way I had trained myself to do at work whenever a document told two different stories depending on who was reading it, and I saved it to a folder on my phone I had started calling, half as a joke to myself, receipts. Over the following weeks, more small things landed in that folder. Simone posted a photo of herself and Marcus at what she called a family strategy dinner, with foundation board members, though neither Caleb nor I had ever been mentioned, invited, or consulted about any strategy involving our family's name. My mother, when I asked again about the fundraising page, told me the total was healthy and that she was handling the disbursement carefully so as not to create complications with Caleb's insurance eligibility, a sentence that sounded plausible enough to someone outside my field and completely hollow to someone who processed insurance eligibility questions every single day for a living. There is a particular kind of provocation that does not announce itself as cruelty. It wears the softer mask of concern, or generosity, or family pride, while quietly making clear that you are being managed rather than heard. Simone specialized in this. One evening, she sent me a private message that began, "I just want you to know we're all thinking of Caleb," and ended with, "Marcus has just been swamped preparing for the gala. It's such an important night for the foundation's future funding. I hope you understand how much pressure he's under." I read it standing in my kitchen, a pot of pasta boiling behind me, and felt something tighten low in my chest, not quite anger yet, something closer to disbelief. I did not respond. I screenshotted it and added it to the folder. It was around this time that I finally called a lawyer, not because I had proof of anything criminal yet, but because the unease in my gut had grown loud enough that I no longer trusted myself to sort through it alone. A colleague at Ridgeline recommended Renata Cole, a family and consumer protection attorney who had handled a fraud case involving a hospital foundation a few years earlier. I called her from my car in the hospital parking garage during my lunch break, my voice low, my hands a little unsteady on the steering wheel. I told her I did not know if anything illegal was happening, only that something about my mother's fundraising page did not add up, and that I needed to know what my options were if my instincts turned out to be right. Renata listened without interrupting, and when I finished, she said something I would repeat to myself many times over the following months. Do not confront anyone yet. Confrontation gives people time to clean up a mess before you can prove it was ever there. Document everything. Let me help you build a record, quietly, so that if you ever need it, it already exists. I told her about the screenshots. She told me to keep going, and to add anything financial I could access, since as Caleb's mother, I had certain legal rights to information about funds raised in his name, even if my own family had never volunteered any of it. Over the following weeks, I began asking, gently and without accusation, a handful of relatives whether they had donated to Caleb's fight fund, and, if so, whether they still had their donation confirmations. I did not mention my mother by name. I did not mention suspicion. I simply said I was trying to keep good records for Caleb's medical file and wanted to make sure every dollar was properly accounted for, which was, in its own way, entirely true. My Aunt Pam sent me her confirmation without hesitation, a screenshot showing $80 given with the memo line, for Caleb's treatment. A family friend from church, a woman named Loretta, who had known me since I was in elementary school, sent hers too, $150 with a note reading, praying for that sweet boy. Each confirmation I received went into the same folder as the screenshots of Simone's posts and my mother's vague reassurances, and slowly, almost without my meaning it to happen, that folder became something closer to a case file than a scrapbook of hurt feelings. There was a night, in the middle of all this quiet collecting, when my mother called me sounding warmer than she had in months. She said she had been thinking about everything Caleb and I had been through, that she wanted to come by that weekend and bring groceries, maybe take Caleb to the park if his energy allowed it, that she felt terrible about how distant she had been. I sat on my back porch after that call, phone still warm in my hand, and felt the old hope rise up in my chest exactly the way it always had, the hope that this time, finally, she meant it. I almost called Renata the next morning to tell her I wanted to pause everything, that maybe I had misjudged my own mother, that maybe grief and exhaustion had made me paranoid rather than perceptive. That weekend came and went, and my mother did not call, did not visit, did not send so much as a text explaining why. When I finally reached her 3 days later, she said something urgent had come up with Marcus's gala preparations, and she had simply lost track of the days. I did not argue. I thanked her for thinking of us, hung up the phone, and sat very still in my kitchen for a long moment. Then I opened the receipts folder and kept going. If you have ever caught yourself hoping, against every piece of evidence in front of you, that the person hurting you might still change, you already understand exactly how I felt that week. Hope, I was learning, could be its own kind of trap, one I had to keep choosing to climb out of, again and again, every time it opened beneath my feet. My father, Walter, remained, as he always had, a quiet presence at the edges of every family conversation, the kind of man who could sit through an entire holiday dinner without once disagreeing with my mother out loud, even when his face told a different story. I did not confide in him during this period, not because I did not love him, but because 36 years of watching him choose peace over honesty had taught me not to expect anything different this time. I was wrong about that, though it would take several more weeks and a night far worse than any I had imagined before I would learn exactly how wrong. I want to pause the timeline here and tell you about a phone call I received from my old friend Denise, a nurse I had known since nursing school days I briefly considered before switching to healthcare administration. Denise worked in the pediatric oncology ward at Ridgeline, several floors from where I worked, and she called me one evening sounding careful in a way that immediately put me on edge. She told me, off the record, as a friend and not as a colleague, that a co-worker of hers had mentioned overhearing hospital foundation staff discussing a generous new corporate table sponsorship for the upcoming gala, purchased under an individual donor's name rather than a company name, which was unusual enough to be remarked upon. She said she did not know any details beyond that, only that the name mentioned sounded, to her ear, uncomfortably close to my own family's name. I thanked her, hung up the phone, and sat in the dark of my living room for a long time after Caleb had gone to bed, turning that fragment of information over and over, unable yet to see the full shape of what it meant, but certain, in the way you are certain of weather changing before the first drop of rain falls, that something significant was coming. The night that changed everything began the night before the gala, when Caleb's remission window ended sooner than the doctors had hoped. His fever spiked again, high enough that I drove him to the emergency room myself at 2 a.m, one hand on the wheel and one hand reaching back to touch his burning forehead at every red light. By the time we were admitted, his platelet count had dropped to a level Dr. Osei, his oncologist, described with a gravity that made my stomach drop through the floor. He needed a platelet transfusion, and soon. But Caleb's blood type carried a rare antigen profile that made him what the transfusion team called a difficult match, someone whose body was prone to rejecting standard donor platelets after so many rounds of chemotherapy had already sensitized his immune system against them. The hospital's blood bank had already tried 2 units from their general supply, both rejected within hours, his fever climbing instead of falling. Dr. Osei explained, as gently as such things can be explained, that our best option now is a directed donor, a specific person whose blood had already been tested months earlier, during Caleb's first round of treatment, and confirmed as an unusually strong match. That person was my brother, Marcus. I remember the relief that flooded through me when Dr. Osei said his name, a relief so complete it nearly buckled my knees right there in the hallway. Of course Marcus would come. Whatever else had happened between us, whatever coldness had grown in the family over the past months, surely this, a direct request that only he could fulfill, a request that could genuinely help save his nephew's life, would be different. I called him myself, standing outside Caleb's room at 4 a.m, my voice shaking as I explained everything Dr. Osei had told me. Marcus was quiet for a moment, then said he would call the hospital's donor center first thing when it opened and get everything scheduled. I thanked him through tears I did not bother hiding, and for the first time in longer than I could remember, I let myself believe my brother might actually show up for us. The donor center called me at 9 that morning to confirm an appointment had been scheduled for Marcus at 11 o'clock that same day, an urgent slot they had specifically opened given the severity of Caleb's condition. I relayed the time to Marcus by text, adding, "Thank you. This means everything." He replied with a thumbs-up emoji. At 10:45, I received a call from the donor center coordinator, her voice apologetic and confused. Marcus had called to reschedule, citing a conflict, and asked whether the appointment could be moved to the following week instead. The following week. I stood in the hallway outside Caleb's room, phone pressed so hard against my ear it left a mark, and asked the coordinator, as calmly as I could manage, whether Caleb's condition could safely wait that long. She hesitated before answering, which told me everything I needed to know before she even said the words. Dr. Osei needed the platelets within the next 24 to 48 hours, ideally sooner, to prevent the kind of internal bleeding risk that came with counts as low as Caleb's had fallen. I called Marcus immediately. He did not answer. I called again. Nothing. I texted him the words directly from Dr. Osei's mouth, quoting his exact language about internal bleeding risk, about the danger window closing, about how genuinely urgent this was, not as a guilt tactic, but as plain medical fact. 40 minutes later, Marcus finally texted back. In gala rehearsal all day, can't get away, they need me for the run-through since I'm being honored tonight. Can the hospital use their regular supply instead? I'm sure they have backups. I read that message standing at the foot of my son's hospital bed, watching a monitor track his heart rate against a platelet count low enough to frighten men and women who saw numbers like it every day for a living. Gala rehearsal. My brother was choosing a stage run-through, choosing the polish of an award ceremony honoring him as a champion of children, over the specific, irreplaceable thing only his own body could give his own nephew in that exact window of time. I called him one more time. This time he answered, sounding rushed and faintly irritated, as though I were the one being unreasonable. "Renee, I told you I'm slammed. Can't this wait until tomorrow morning? The gala's tonight. I have to be there for rehearsal. It's a huge deal for the foundation." I do not remember exactly what I said back to him. I remember my voice cracking on the word please, a word I had promised myself years earlier I would stop using with my family because it never once changed anything. I remember him saying, almost gently, as if he believed he were being reasonable, "The hospital has other donors, right? You're overreacting a little, Renee. He's going to be fine." He hung up before I could answer. Dr. Osei, when I told her Marcus could not come until the next day, did not editorialize. She simply nodded, said they would broaden the search for a compatible unit through the regional blood network immediately, and warned me honestly that the process would take longer and carry more uncertainty than a direct match would have. For the next 14 hours, I sat beside Caleb's bed, watching his fever climb again, watching a bruise bloom slowly and terrifyingly across the inside of his arm from a simple blood draw, a visible sign of exactly the danger Dr. Osei had warned about. Nurse Denise came in twice during her shift, checking his vitals with a tightness around her eyes I had never seen on her before. Around midnight, Caleb woke briefly, disoriented and scared, and asked me in a small, cracked voice why his arm hurt so much. I told him it would be okay. I did not know, in that moment, if I was telling him the truth. I sat in that chair through the entire night, watching the door, half hoping against reason that Marcus might change his mind and walk through it anyway, that some flicker of understanding about what was actually at stake might reach him in time. He did not come. At 6 the next morning, the regional blood network located a compatible unit from a donor 2 hours away, and Dr. Osei personally walked it down to Caleb's room herself, staying until the transfusion began, watching the monitor with the same careful attention I imagine she gave every child on that floor whose family could not provide what mine had failed to. Caleb's fever finally broke around noon. His platelet count began climbing that evening. He would be okay, Dr. Osei told me, her hand resting briefly on my shoulder in a gesture more honest than anything my own mother had offered me in months. He would be okay, this time, because a stranger 2 hours away had given blood to a child he had never met, while my brother stood under stage lights that same night, accepting applause for a cause he claimed, in front of a ballroom of donors, meant everything to him. I did not attend the gala. I was not invited, and even if I had been, I would have been sitting exactly where I belonged, in a hospital chair beside my son. But Simone posted photos from the event that night, Marcus in a tailored navy suit, holding a small crystal award shaped like a rising star, grinning beside a banner that read, in gold script, Community Champion, Marcus Hartley. The caption read, "So incredibly proud. Tonight is about every child who needs someone to show up for them." I read that caption sitting in a hospital chair, my son finally asleep beside me, a fresh bruise still darkening on his thin arm, and I felt something inside me go very quiet and very still, the way a house goes quiet in the moment just before a storm actually arrives. I did not comment on the post. I did not call Marcus. I opened the receipts folder on my phone, and for the first time, I added something that was not a screenshot of vague reassurance or careless cruelty, but a screenshot of my own text messages, time-stamped, showing exactly what I had asked my brother to do, exactly when I had asked it, and exactly what he had chosen instead. Caleb woke the next morning enough to ask me, in the small, quiet voice children use when they are trying to understand something too large for them, why Uncle Marcus never came to give him the special blood the doctor talked about. I brushed the hair back from his forehead and told him the truth, softened only as much as an 8-year-old needed it softened. Uncle Marcus had somewhere else to be, baby. But a very kind stranger came instead, and that's why you're feeling better today. Caleb thought about that for a long moment, his small fingers picking at the edge of his paper cape lying folded on the blanket beside him. A stranger loved me more than Uncle Marcus did, he said finally, not as a question, but as a simple conclusion a child reaches when the evidence in front of him leaves no other honest answer. I did not correct him. I did not know, in that moment, how I possibly could have. If you have ever watched someone choose their own image over the safety of a child, tell me in the comments, because that was the night I stopped waiting for my family to become people they had already shown me, over and over, they had no intention of becoming. 2 days after Caleb's transfusion, while he slept through most of the afternoon still recovering, I finally called Renata Cole and told her everything, the missed appointment, the gala rehearsal, the stranger who had ultimately saved my son while my brother accepted an award for caring about children exactly like him. She was quiet for a moment on the other end of the line, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted into something more focused, more urgent. "Renee, I think it's time we look seriously at that fundraising page your mother set up. Do you have any access to it at all?" I did not directly, but I remembered something Nurse Denise had mentioned weeks earlier, the fragment about a generous individual donor table sponsorship purchased under a name that sounded uncomfortably close to my own family's. I called Denise back that evening and asked her, as directly as I could, whether she could find out anything more without putting her own job at risk. She promised to ask carefully, and 2 days later, She sent me a photograph she had taken of a printed donor acknowledgement card sitting on a bulletin board in the Hospital Foundation's administrative office, the kind of card foundations print and display to thank major sponsors publicly. The card read, in elegant embossed lettering, "Table sponsorship generously given in honor of Caleb Foster." My hands went cold reading that caption. In honor of Caleb Foster. My son, lying in a hospital bed 2 floors above that bulletin board, fighting for his platelet count to stay above a number that kept him safe, had apparently funded, through some arrangement I had never agreed to or even known about, the very table his uncle sat at while accepting applause for caring about children like him. I forwarded the photograph to Renata immediately. She called me within the hour. "This is what we needed," she said, and there was something in her voice that was not quite triumph, more like the particular relief of a person who has finally found solid ground after walking blind across ice for weeks. A donation solicited using your son's name, diverted toward personal recognition for your brother rather than his stated medical purpose. That is not a family disagreement anymore, Renee. Depending on the amounts involved, this could constitute charitable solicitation fraud. She asked me to gather everything I had collected so far, every screenshot, every donor confirmation, every text message, and send it to her secure portal that same evening. I stayed up past midnight compiling it all, Caleb sleeping beside me in the recliner I had learned to fold my body into during the long weeks of his hospitalization. By the time I finished, the file was 31 pages long, spanning 4 months, documenting a pattern too consistent to be dismissed as a misunderstanding. The next morning, I did something I had been putting off for weeks. I called my father, Walter, directly, and asked him one simple question. "Dad, do you know anything about the money people have been donating for Caleb's treatment?" There was a long silence on the line, long enough that I nearly asked if he was still there. When he finally spoke, his voice sounded smaller than I had ever heard it. "Your mother mentioned she was handling some fundraising." I didn't ask many questions, Renee. I never do. I told him, gently but plainly, what Denise's photograph had shown, what the donor confirmations added up to, what Marcus had chosen over Caleb's transfusion appointment. My father was quiet for a long time after I finished. "I need to think," he finally said, and hung up before I could respond. I did not know, in that moment, whether I had just lost the last small thread connecting me to my family, or whether I had just planted something that might, eventually, grow into an honest conversation. It would take him 12 more days to answer that question for me. In the meantime, Renata filed a formal request for accounting on my behalf, demanding my mother produce a complete record of every dollar raised through Caleb's Fight Fund, every donor, every date, every disbursement. My mother's response arrived through a lawyer of her own 3 days later, a short letter claiming all funds had been collected voluntarily for general family support and that disbursement decisions had been left entirely to her discretion as the page's organizer. Renata read me the letter over the phone, her tone flat and professional, though I could hear something sharper underneath it. "This is actually helpful to us," she said. She's admitting, in writing, that she controlled the funds and made unilateral decisions about how to spend money donated for your son's medical care. That is not a defense, Renee. That is a confession dressed up in careful language. A local television producer named Lena Cho reached out to me around the same time, having heard, through channels I never fully understood, that there might be a story worth investigating connected to the Rising Stars Foundation and its recent community champion honoree. She explained that her station had already begun looking into the foundation's gala sponsorships after receiving an anonymous tip, and that Caleb's situation, if I was willing to share it, could illustrate something important about how easily charitable donations could be misdirected without proper oversight. I told her I needed to think about it, and I meant it. Some tired, protective part of me still did not want strangers watching my son's illness unfold on a screen, still did not want to hand our private pain over to an audience. Then Caleb, half awake one afternoon while I sat beside his bed reviewing donor confirmations on my laptop, asked me quietly why Grandma and Uncle Marcus never visited anymore. I told him, as I always did, that grown-ups sometimes made choices that were hard to understand, and that none of it was his fault. He nodded slowly, the way he always did when an answer did not quite satisfy him, but he was too tired to push further. then asked one more question that settled the decision for me completely. Did they forget me because I got sick? I called Lena Cho back that same evening and told her yes, I was willing to talk on one condition. She could film a short piece with Caleb only if he wanted to participate, and I would decide, moment to moment, what he was and was not comfortable sharing. She agreed without hesitation, and 2 days later, she arrived at the hospital with a single cameraman, keeping her voice soft, her questions gentle, her presence small enough that Caleb, propped up against his pillows with his paper cape draped over his shoulders exactly the way he liked it, barely seemed to notice the camera at all. She asked him what he wanted most, now that the hardest part of his treatment was behind him for now. Caleb thought about the question with the seriousness only a sick child seems able to summon, then said, in a small, clear voice that I will hear for the rest of my life, I just wanted my grandma to come. No one in that room spoke for a long moment after he said it. Before Lena left the hospital that evening, I showed her the screenshots on my phone, the group chat messages, my brother's reply about being swamped, my mother's words about not making Caleb our emergency, the donor acknowledgement card photographed on the foundation's bulletin board. Lena's expression did not change much as she read them, but her silence afterward told me she understood exactly what she was looking at. If you let us use these, she said carefully, people in this city are going to recognize your family's name eventually, even if we blur what we can. I need you to be certain before we move forward. I looked at the empty visitor chair that had sat beside Caleb's bed for 4 straight months, mostly untouched by anyone who shared his blood, and I told her I was certain. I signed a release form specifying exactly what could be used, no private medical details, no footage without my direct consent, only Caleb's brief interview, the messages I chose to share, and the donor acknowledgement card Denise had photographed. I read every line before signing. I had spent too many months being careless with hope. I did not intend to be careless with this. The segment aired at 10 o'clock that night, several weeks after the Hometown Heroes Gala had wrapped, long after the Foundation's highlight reel of that evening had already been shared across its social media accounts. The broadcast opened with footage from the gala. Marcus at the podium in his tailored suit, his voice smooth and practiced as he told the ballroom, "No child should ever have to face something this frightening alone." Then the screen shifted, and there was Caleb, small in his hospital bed, his paper cape draped over his shoulders, his voice barely above a whisper. I just wanted my grandma to come. Lena's voiceover explained, calmly and without dramatization, that while donors across the city had gathered that same evening to honor a local philanthropist for his commitment to children in crisis, one 8-year-old boy in active cancer treatment had received a very different response from his own family after asking them to visit. Then the messages appeared on screen, names blurred but words intact. Swamped, you'll figure it out. He pulled through, don't make this our emergency too. I was not with any of them when it aired, and I did not need to be. Lena sent me a message an hour later with a screen recording of what was already unfolding online, the broadcast racing across the same social media accounts that had celebrated the gala weeks before, comment threads filling faster than anyone could moderate them. In the threads, people who had applauded Marcus that night were quietly deleting their own congratulatory posts, while others openly demanded to know where the money had gone. My mother, whose name had sat on the sponsor materials Caleb's illness had unknowingly funded, went silent across every account she had. For the first time in my entire life, my family was not controlling the story being told about them. They were trapped inside it, in real time, in a city full of people who had, until that exact moment, believed every word they had ever said. My phone did not stop buzzing after that. Some messages came from relatives I had not heard from in months, cousins, an aunt, a family friend from church, all of them asking, in various tones of horror, whether what they had just watched was real. A few messages came from people who had donated to Caleb's Fight Fund, asking, with a directness that made my stomach twist, whether their money had actually gone anywhere near my son's medical bills. My Aunt Pam wrote, I sent $80 believing it would help pay for his treatment. Please tell me that's true. I did not answer any of them that night. Caleb slept through most of it, mercifully unaware that the small, honest sentence he had spoken into a camera was rearranging the entire architecture of our extended family in real time. I sat beside his bed with my phone silenced in the drawer of the bedside table, and for the first time in months, I let their panic exist without my involvement in managing it. By morning, I had 41 unread messages and, more importantly, 7 new donor confirmations forwarded to me unprompted from people who, having seen the broadcast, wanted to know exactly where their earlier contributions had gone. I forwarded every single one to Renata. 2 days later, the story had moved well beyond a single broadcast segment. Lena's station ran a follow-up piece, this time focused entirely on the donor acknowledgement card and the paper trail Renata's office had begun assembling. The Rising Stars Foundation issued a statement within hours, announcing that Marcus Hartley had been suspended from all donor-facing roles and public representation pending an internal review of the gala's sponsorship arrangements. By that same afternoon, the District Attorney's Consumer Protection Division confirmed it had received multiple complaints regarding solicited charitable donations and was opening a preliminary inquiry. My mother called 11 times that first day. I answered none of them. When she finally reached me through a number I did not recognize, her voice was not soft or apologetic. It was sharp, controlled, the same voice she had always used when a situation refused to bend to her version of events. "Do you have any idea what you have done to this family?" she asked before I had even said hello. I stood in my kitchen, phone pressed to my ear, and felt something in me that had been coiled tight for months finally, quietly, release. "I documented what you did to my son," I said. "That's all this ever was." She was quiet for a moment, and when she spoke again, her voice had shifted, not into remorse, but into strategy. "If you cooperate now, tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them the money was always meant for the family broadly. This can still be contained. Marcus's career depends on this, Renee. Think about what you're doing to him." I thought about the bruise that had bloomed across my son's arm the night his blood would not clot properly while his uncle stood in a rehearsal hall practicing his acceptance speech. "I have thought about it," I told her. "I've thought about very little else." I ended the call before she could say anything more. Marcus texted me later that same day, a long message insisting the gala table had been purchased with his own personal funds, that the donor card must have been a foundation clerical error, that I was destroying his reputation over a misunderstanding I refused to even discuss with him privately. I forwarded the message to Renata without responding to him directly. She called me an hour later.
"His own funds," she said.
"That's actually useful for us, because the donation records I've already pulled show a different story entirely. If he claims personal funds and the paper trail shows your mother's collected donations moving directly into that sponsorship, he's just handed us a documented lie to compare against the actual transfer records." Over the following week, the pieces continued falling into place with a momentum that no longer required much pushing for me at all. Renata's office subpoenaed the crowdfunding platform's transaction records for Caleb's Fight Fund and matched them, dollar for dollar, against the foundation's sponsorship payment for the table listed in Caleb's honor. The amounts lined up almost exactly, for $1,200 raised through the fund, for $1,000 paid toward the sponsorship, the remaining $200 unaccounted for in any record my mother's own attorney could produce. Not $1 of it had ever touched Caleb's actual medical bills, which I had continued paying, slowly and painfully, entirely on my own throughout the exact months the fund had supposedly been collecting money to help me carry that weight. My father called me 12 days after our first conversation about the donations, exactly as long as it apparently took him to work up whatever courage he needed to say what came next. His voice, when I answered, sounded older than I remembered it sounding even at Mark's funeral. "I went through our joint bank statements," he said, without preamble. "I found the transfer your mother made to the foundation. I have the records. I want to give them to your lawyer." I sat down slowly at my kitchen table, Caleb's homework spread out in front of me from the half-day of school he had finally been well enough to attend that week. "Why now, Dad?" asked, not unkindly but honestly, because I needed to understand. He was quiet for a long moment. "Because I watched my grandson tell a stranger with a camera that he just wanted his grandmother to visit him," he finally said, "and I realized I have spent 30 years telling myself that staying quiet was the same thing as being a good man. It isn't. I should have asked more questions a long time ago about a lot of things, not just this. It was not a complete apology. It did not undo a lifetime of silence in the face of favoritism I had absorbed alone as a child, or 4 months of silence while his own grandson lay in a hospital bed asking why no one came. But it was the first honest sentence my father had offered me in longer than I could remember, and I found, to my own surprise, that I was willing to let it be a beginning rather than demanding it be an ending. He sent Renata the bank statements that same afternoon, records showing the exact transfer from a joint account he shared with my mother into the foundation's sponsorship fund, dated 3 days before the gala. Renata called it, in her careful legal language, corroborating documentary evidence, but to me it simply meant my father had finally chosen to stand somewhere other than the sidelines. My mother came to the hospital once more after that, alone this time, without Marcus beside her for the first occasion I could remember in years. Nurse Denise intercepted her at the nurse's station before she could reach Caleb's room, and I watched through the small window in the door as my mother's carefully composed expression flickered, just briefly, into something that looked almost like fear. I stepped into the hallway and closed Caleb's door behind me, so he would not have to hear whatever came next. My mother held a bouquet of white lilies, the kind of gesture she had always reached for when words failed her, or when she needed a prop to perform grief or love she had not actually taken the time to feel. "Renee, this has gone far enough," she said, using words that assumed I was the one who had escalated things, rather than the one who had simply stopped hiding what she had already done. "Renee," I corrected quietly. "My name is Renee." Something in her face tightened at that, as though even my own name spoken with the wrong emphasis was one more piece of evidence against her. "You are destroying your brother's career over a misunderstanding," she said. "That money was always meant to help the family broadly. Marcus needed that table for his professional reputation. Reputation opens doors that could have helped all of us eventually, including Caleb." I stood very still in that hallway, the same hallway where I had once let myself believe she might finally show up for us, and I felt, for the first time in longer than I could remember, no urge at all to soften what came next. "Caleb needed a platelet donor while his uncle rehearsed an acceptance speech," I said. "He needed his grandmother to visit him after major surgery for sepsis, and you told him he wasn't your emergency. You used his name and his illness to buy your son a table at a party. There is no version of that sentence where the word misunderstanding belongs." Her composure cracked slightly, not into remorse, but into something closer to panic. "If this becomes a criminal matter, it will destroy me," she said. I thought of Caleb asking me, in his small, tired voice, whether a stranger had loved him more than his own uncle had. "What destroys you," I said, "is not the truth coming out. It's what you did before anyone was watching." I did not let her into the room that day. Security, called quietly by Nurse Denise before things could escalate further in a pediatric hallway full of frightened families and sick children, escorted her out when she refused to leave the nurse's station. I did not watch her go. I went back into Caleb's room, sat beside his bed, and held his hand until his breathing settled back into the slow, even rhythm of real sleep, the kind he had not managed easily in months. The consequences my family had spent so many years successfully avoiding began arriving, one after another, over the following weeks, not through any dramatic confrontation on my part, but simply through the steady, unglamorous machinery of documentation finally being allowed to speak for itself. The Rising Stars Foundation completed its internal review and permanently removed Marcus from any future donor or board involvement, issuing a public statement acknowledging that funds solicited for a specific child's medical care had been redirected toward event sponsorship without the family's knowledge or consent. His employer, a commercial real estate firm that had happily used his charitable image in its own marketing materials for years, quietly ended his public-facing role there as well, citing what they called reputational concerns unrelated to his job performance, language everyone involved understood to mean something considerably less generous. My mother's church, where she had served for nearly a decade on the Charitable Outreach Committee, asked her to step down after several congregation members who had donated to Caleb's Fight Fund came forward with their own donor confirmations, asking the same painful questions my Aunt Pam had asked me the night the story first broke. The district attorney's Consumer Protection Division continued its inquiry, and Renata filed a civil claim on Caleb's behalf seeking the full return of every dollar raised in his name, plus documented medical expenses I had continued absorbing alone throughout the entire ordeal. My mother's own attorney, faced with the platform's transaction records lining up exactly against the foundation's sponsorship payment, quietly opened settlement discussions rather than risk a criminal referral moving forward through the district attorney's office. I did not celebrate any of it the way I once imagined I might, back in the earliest days of quietly building that folder on my phone. There was no triumphant moment, no dramatic courtroom scene, only a slow, steady unwinding of consequences that arrived mostly through emails from Renata's office and phone calls I answered with a flat, tired kind of relief rather than victory. What I felt instead, more than anything, was the strange, wide, unfamiliar space that opened up in me once I finally stopped bracing for my family's next disappointment. For years, their needs, their image, their careful management of every room had filled every corner of my attention. Now there was room, finally, simply for Caleb, and for whatever piece the two of us could build without anyone else's permission. The settlement, when it finally came through 8 weeks later, returned every dollar raised through Caleb's Fight Fund into a properly managed medical account Renata helped me establish, transparent and fully documented, with a receipt sent to every single donor, showing exactly where their contribution had finally landed. Aunt Pam cried on the phone when I called to tell her, apologizing for not checking sooner, and I told her, honestly, that she had nothing to apologize for. She had trusted a grandmother's word about her own grandson. That trust had never been the problem. The betrayal of it had been. I used part of the recovered funds, along with a portion of the additional settlement Renata secured to cover documented medical expenses I had absorbed alone for months, to finally pay down the mountain of bills that had been quietly crushing me since Caleb's relapse began. What remained, I decided, would not simply sit in an account collecting interest while I tried to forget how it had come to exist. I started something small. At first, calling it Caleb's Cape Fund, named for the paper cape he had insisted on wearing through every transfusion, every fever spike, every long night neither of us had been sure would end well. The fund provided small, practical support to families keeping vigil beside hospitalized children, meal vouchers for the cafeteria, gas cards for the long drives some families made from hours away, parking passes that did not require choosing between a hospital visit and a grocery bill that same week. Small things, maybe, but I understood better than most exactly how enormous small things become when you are sitting alone in a chair beside a bed, watching a monitor, with no one else in the room to hand any part of that weight to. Caleb came with me the first time we delivered care bags to the pediatric floor, moving slowly still, but insisting on carrying at least one bag himself, his paper cape, now slightly worn at the folds, tucked carefully into his backpack for the occasion. He handed a stuffed animal to a younger boy waiting nervously for his own round of tests, and something in the quiet, generous way he did it, without any performance behind it at all, made my chest ache in a way that had nothing to do with grief this time. My father began visiting regularly after that, always calling first to ask whether it was a good time, never assuming, the way he once had, that his presence was owed rather than earned. He did not bring flowers the way my mother always had, as though flowers alone could substitute for actually showing up. He brought a small telescope one Saturday, because Caleb had mentioned, weeks earlier during one long hospital afternoon, that he wanted to see Saturn's rings for himself someday. They spent that evening in my backyard, my father patiently adjusting the lens while Caleb pressed his eye to the eyepiece, gasping when the rings finally came into focus. It was not a grand gesture. It was not meant to undo 36 years of silence in a single evening. But it was consistent week after week, in a way nothing for my mother or Marcus had ever been, and consistency, I was slowly learning, mattered infinitely more than any single dramatic apology ever could. My mother reached out twice more in the months that followed, once through a lawyer's letter proposing what she called a path toward reconciliation, contingent on my agreeing not to pursue any further legal action, and once through a text message from a new number I did not recognize, reading simply, "You'll be fine. You always land on your feet." I read that message standing in my kitchen, Caleb doing homework at the table behind me, and I thought about every year I had spent believing that surviving without help somehow proved I did not need any. I did not reply to either attempt. I did not block her number, not out of any lingering hope, but because I no longer needed the symbolic gesture of blocking someone whose voice had simply stopped having power over how I felt each morning I woke up. Marcus never reached out at all, not once, in any form, after the settlement was finalized. I understood, eventually, that his silence was its own kind of answer, the same answer he had already given the night he chose a rehearsal hall over his own nephew's transfusion appointment. Some people do not disappear because circumstances force them to. They disappear because showing up in any real and costly way was never something they were actually capable of offering in the first place. One evening, nearly a year after that first photograph I sent into our family's group chat, Caleb and I sat together on the back porch, watching the last of the daylight fade behind the fence line Mark had built the summer before he died. Caleb's hair had grown back and soft and dark, his color returned to something close to the ordinary healthy pink of any 8-year-old's cheeks. He still had checkups every few months, still carried, somewhere beneath his easy laughter, a wariness around hospitals that I suspected might never fully leave him. But he was here, healthy, laughing at something absurd on the television inside, and that alone on the hardest nights had once felt like more than I dared hope for. "Mommy," he said, out of nowhere, the way children do when a thought has been sitting quietly in them for a while before finally finding its way out. Grandpa said families don't have to share the same house to still be a family. I smiled, watching the sky deepen into that particular shade of blue that comes right before real dark settles in. Grandpa's right about that. But Grandma and Uncle Marcus aren't really family anymore, are they? I thought carefully about how to answer him, the way I had learned to think carefully about every hard truth he asked me to explain over the past year. Family isn't just about the people who share your blood, sweetheart, I said finally. It's about the people who show up, even when it costs them something. Grandpa shows up now. That nurse, Denise, and Dr. Osei, they showed up. The stranger who gave you his platelets that night, he showed up and we don't even know his name. That's family too, in its own way. Caleb considered that for a long moment, tracing the worn edge of his paper cape, which he still kept folded in his desk drawer, though he had long since stopped needing to wear it into hospital rooms. "I like that kind of family better," he said finally. I pulled him a little closer against my side, watching the first stars begin to appear over the fence line, and thought about every year I had spent believing that love owed to me by blood would eventually arrive if I simply waited long enough, worked hard enough, stayed easy enough to love. I know better now. Family is not the people you are obligated to forgive because you happen to share a name. Family is the people who show up when showing up actually costs them something, who tell you the truth gently instead of managing you carefully, and who never, under any circumstances, make a sick child feel like an inconvenience for needing to be loved. That is the story of the year my family finally showed me exactly who they were, and the year I finally believed them. If you have ever been told your pain was an inconvenience to someone who was supposed to protect you, I hope you know the way I finally learned to know that you were never the problem. Share this with someone who has spent too long carrying a family silence as though it were their own fault. Leave a comment and tell me what you would have done in that hospital hallway. And if you believe quiet people eventually deserve justice, make sure you are subscribed because this will not be the last story we tell together.